From Hollywood blockbusters to, those whispered rumors, the image of the mafia really looms large in our collective
It
imagination.
really does.
But if you strip away all that cinematic gloss,
Hmm.
what's actually left?
Yeah.
What were the true roots of this powerful force in American history, and how did it really operate?
Exactly. Today, we're plunging into a comprehensive overview of the American Mafia. We're drawing on a whole range of sources here to understand its journey from, well, obscure immigrant communities all the way to its deep entanglement with the nation's economy.
Okay.
And, its long battles with law enforcement, the real intricacies of its internal structure, and even some, well, eyebrow-raising instances of cooperation with the U.S. government.
Really?
Yeah. Our aim today is really to cut through the mythology and reveal the core elements of this enduring criminal phenomenon and its lasting impact.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Starting with the language itself. We hear so many terms thrown around. American Mafia, Italian-American Mafia, the mob, Cosa Nostra. Are these just like different ways of saying the same thing?
Not entirely, though they are often used interchangeably. American Mafia and Italian-American Mafia typically refer to these specific criminal organizations within the United States.
Great.
Italian Mafia or Italian mob can be a bit broader. Sometimes it includes groups based back in Italy, like the Sicilian Mafia, the Camorra, the 'Ndrangheta, related but distinct entities.
Gotcha.
And Cosa Nostra, which means our thing, or this thing of ours in Italian, that was apparently a term favored by members themselves. Eventually, the American government adopted it as La Cosa Nostra, or LCN.
Huh.
Interestingly, the term American Mafia, at least initially, specifically meant mafia groups that came from Sicily and were operating in the U.S.
So when did this thing of ours first really take hold on American soil? Our sources seem to point to a couple of different places, right?
Yeah, the earliest documented activity seems to pop up in New Orleans, way back in the late 1860s.
That early, wow.
Yeah. Newspaper reports from back then detail conflicts between various Sicilian gangs, and their affiliations, traced back to different cities in Sicily: Palermo, Trapani, Messina. So this suggests that the early mafia presence wasn't some single unified thing. It was more like a collection of interconnected and sometimes warring groups.
That's fascinating. Not a monolith from the get-go. So how did it evolve into the more, structured organization we tend to think of today?
Well, that evolution really took place within the growing Italian immigrant communities. Late 19th, early 20th centuries. Think big cities like New York, Chicago, New Orleans again.
Right, where the communities were forming.
Exactly. Waves of immigration, especially from southern Italy and Sicily, created fertile ground for these networks to take root. Now, it's important to differentiate the mafia itself from the Black Hand.
Ah, okay. I've heard of that.
Yeah, it was a really prevalent extortion tactic in Italian neighborhoods around the same time. But while people sometimes confuse it with the mafia, the Black Hand was more a loose collection of smaller gangs using similar, coercive methods.
Yeah.
It wasn't a unified criminal organization like the mafia would eventually become.
So more of a method than a group.
Kind of, yeah. A tactic used by various small-time crooks, sometimes connected, sometimes not.
Okay. Who were some of the key individuals who shaped those really early years then?
Well, Giuseppe Esposito holds the distinction of being the first known mafia member to immigrate to the U.S. He arrived in New York in the 1880s. He'd been involved in some pretty serious stuff back in Sicily: land disputes, murders.
Right.
Then in New York City, the Five Points Gang was critical, founded by Paul Kelly.
Huh.
Kelly's recruits included guys who would become huge mafia powerhouses later on: Johnny Torrio, Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, Frankie Yale.
Wow, that's a rose gallery right there.
It really is. And these early gangs, they often clashed violently with Jewish gangs who were vying for control of the same turf. We also saw activity from the Camorra, another Italian group, over in Brooklyn. And Chicago had significant mafia-related violence in its bloody 19th Ward, an Italian neighborhood known for really intense internal feuds.
And New Orleans keeps cropping up in these early stories. What was happening there that was so significant?
Well, New Orleans saw a really pivotal event in 1890, the assassination of Police Superintendent David Hennessy.
The police superintendent.
Yeah. Now, the extent of Italian immigrant involvement and the real motivations behind it, That's still debated by historians. Some argue it was really fueled by anti-immigrant prejudice at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless, hundreds of Sicilians were arrested in the aftermath, 19 were indicted, and after they were acquitted, a vigilante mob stormed the jail in 1891 and lynched 11 of the defendants.
Lynching them. Good Lord.
Yeah, a horrific incident. And it really brought the issue of Italian organized crime in America to national, even international attention, marked a really grim early chapter.
That paints a really stark picture. Okay, jumping ahead a few decades then to 1919, the start of Prohibition.
Yeah.
That must have just been like throwing gasoline on a fire, right?
Oh, absolutely. An explosive catalyst is a good way to put it. Prohibition, by outlawing booze production, transport, sale, it inadvertently created this massive, completely unregulated black market.
And everyone still wanted to drink?
Exactly. Public demand for liquor was sky high, and this led to a significant rise in the murder rate, as you'd expect, with competing gangs fighting tooth and nail for control of this incredibly lucrative trade.
More money than ever before, I bet.
Way more. The potential profits from bootlegging just dwarfed anything they were making for traditional crimes. And this period also coincided with an influx of Sicilian mafia members fleeing Mussolini's crackdown back in Italy.
Ah, so more experienced criminals arriving too.
Precisely. It further strengthened their presence and added these hardened criminal elements to the mix over here.
So it wasn't just about making money then. It sounds like Prohibition fundamentally reshaped organized crime itself, how it worked.
Exactly right. Prohibition forced these previously disparate criminal groups to organize on a much larger, much more sophisticated scale. They had to manage the complexities of production, distribution, protection,
Logistics.
big-time logistics, and this necessity led to the development of more structured criminal organizations. Mafia families evolved, establishing clearer hierarchical roles. You had bosses, lawyers, truckers, enforcers, each playing a vital part in the whole bootlegging operation.
And this led to wars, right?
Well,
Different groups.
Oh, yeah. Bloody turf wars. These Italian gangs clashed constantly with Irish gangs, Jewish gangs, all fighting for dominance in this illegal industry. Think of Frankie Yale versus the White Hand Gang in Brooklyn, or Al Capone versus the North Side Gang in Chicago.
Right.
And then in New York City, you had the really brutal Castellamarese War. This was a conflict between factions led by Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. It ultimately ended with Masseria getting violently whacked in 1931.
And Maranzano briefly stepped in as the top guy. The boss of all bosses, didn't he?
He did, yeah. For a very short time, though. Maranzano tried to impose a more rigid structure. He's the one who formally divided New York City into the 5 families we still hear about. He also introduced, like, a code of conduct, procedures for resolving disputes, but his ambition to be the single boss of all bosses, well, that proved to be his downfall.
How so?
Within 6 months, he was murdered. On the orders of Lucky Luciano, Luciano recognized that this top-down approach just created instability, resentment. It wasn't sustainable.
Which paved the way for the commission. That sounds like a much more collaborative model, it seems.
Exactly. In 1931, right after Maranzano was out of the picture, Luciano strategically replaced that whole boss of all bosses idea with the commission.
So what was it, like a board of directors for crime?
Pretty much, yeah. It was a ruling council made up of the bosses of the most powerful mafia families. They were supposed to have equal say, voting power on critical decisions. It acted as a forum to resolve interfamily conflicts peacefully, or at least less violently. And the shift, it really ushered in a period of, relatively speaking, stability and prosperity for the American mafia. By the mid-20th century, there were 26 official commission-sanctioned families across the United States.
26, wow.
Yeah, and each one generally controlled specific territories. The big exception was New York City, where the 5 families obviously had overlapping territory.
It's interesting how these younger leaders, the young Turks like Luciano, they seemed more willing to work with other ethnic criminal groups.
Yeah.
That feels like a very pragmatic, business-like approach.
It was exactly that, pragmatic. The older generation, guys often called the mustache Petes, they generally preferred to operate exclusively within Italian circles. Keep it in the family, you know.
Right. The old school.
But the younger, more forward-thinking leaders like Luciano, they saw the immense potential for much greater profits by forging alliances, cooperating with other criminal organizations, particularly Jewish American syndicates like Meyer Lansky's group.
Made sense from a business perspective.
Totally. But even with this willingness to collaborate externally, they still maintained really strict internal rules, rooted in Sicilian tradition. You still had that rigid hierarchical structure, and of course, the infamous code of silence, omerta. Break that, and the consequences were severe, often fatal.
Okay, so Prohibition ends. The big cash cow of bootlegging is gone.
Mhm.
How did the Mafia adapt to keep that immense wealth flowing? It seems like they branched out quite a bit.
They absolutely did. That vast capital they'd built up during Prohibition gave them the financial foundation to expand into a whole range of other illicit activities.
Like what?
Well, they moved heavily into illegal gambling operations, loan sharking, lending money at insane interest rates, extortion rackets, providing illegal protection, trafficking narcotics, dealing in stolen goods, fencing,
Hmm.
and significantly, labor racketeering.
Hmm.
Getting control over powerful labor unions like the Teamsters and the International Longshoremen's Association.
Labor union control. That sounds like a particularly insidious way to exert power. How did that actually work?
Well, controlling these unions allowed the mafia to infiltrate numerous legitimate industries. We're talking construction, demolition, waste management, trucking, the garment industry, you name it.
And how did they benefit?
They could manipulate union pension funds, raid them, essentially. They could extort businesses by threatening strikes or slowdowns if they didn't pay up. They could rig bids for major construction projects.
So controlling who gets the jobs.
Exactly. In New York City, for example, the five families had huge influence over most major construction projects and their control of waterfront unions. That let them steal valuable goods coming into the ports. Very lucrative.
And their geographical reach kept expanding too, right? Beyond those initial East Coast hubs.
Yeah.
Cuba and Las Vegas come to mind as major areas of influence later on.
Absolutely. Meyer Lansky, Luciano's associate, played a key role in making connections with the Cuban casino industry back in the 1930s. That relationship really flourished after his friend Fulgencio Batista became president in 1952.
So they invested heavily down there.
Yeah, several mafia bosses put significant money into legalized casinos in Havana. But that all came to a very abrupt end with the Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro nationalized all the U.S.-owned businesses, casinos included.
Okay, so Cuba was a bust eventually. What about Vegas?
Las Vegas was different. It was strategically considered an open city, meaning no single family had exclusive rights. Once Nevada legalized gambling, mafia families from various cities, not just New York, but Cleveland, Kansas City, Milwaukee, Chicago, others too, they all moved in.
How did they fund it? Casinos aren't cheap.
Often they used loans from the Teamsters pension fund, which, as we mentioned, they heavily influenced. And they employed seemingly legitimate frontmen to actually establish and operate the casinos.
Keep their names off the paperwork.
Right, and a significant chunk of the casino's cash profits was skimmed right off the top before being officially reported. Classic mafia tactic. Millions just disappeared.
For a long time, it really felt like law enforcement was constantly playing catch-up. What were the main challenges they faced in tackling such a, deeply entrenched criminal enterprise?
Well, initially, local law enforcement agencies often just lacked the resources, the expertise, even a basic awareness of the mafia's existence and its national scope. It wasn't something they were trained to deal with.
And corruption must have been a factor.
Oh, a huge obstacle. Bribery, witness intimidation. These were rampant tactics used by the mafia to just evade prosecution. It wasn't really until the 1951 Kefauver hearings, run by a U.S. Senate committee, that the existence of this sinister criminal organization, quote unquote, called the Mafia, was officially acknowledged on a national level.
So that brought it into the open.
It brought the issue into the public consciousness, definitely. Although many of the suspected mobsters who were called to testify famously just feigned ignorance or pleaded the fifth.
Of course.
Standard playbook.
And then came that pivotal Appalachian meeting in 1957. That really seemed to pull back the curtain on the Mafia's national network, didn't it?
It absolutely did. It was almost accidental. The New York State Police stumbled upon this massive gathering of top mafia figures from all across the country, meeting in the tiny, tiny town of Appalachian, New York.
What were they doing there?
Trying to sort out internal business, apparently. But the sheer number and the high-ranking status of the guys who were caught fleeing the scene, It exposed the nationwide reach and the interconnectedness of the mafia like never before.
And that finally got the FBI's attention.
It forced the FBI, yeah, including its director, J. Edgar Hoover, who had been, let's say, reluctant to admit the mafia even existed on a national scale. It forced them to recognize organized crime as a serious national threat. That event was a major turning point in how law enforcement approached investigating and combating the mafia.
But in terms of public awareness and really cracking that wall of silence, omerta. Joe Valachi's testimony in the 1960s sounds like it was truly groundbreaking.
Oh, absolutely. Monumental. In 1963, Joe Valachi, who was just a soldier in the Genovese family, he became the first mafia member to publicly cooperate with law enforcement. He provided incredibly detailed testimony about the organization's inner workings, its rituals, its secrets.
And he named names.
He named names, he explained the structure, and crucially, he confirmed its very existence to the world. He's the one who really popularized the term Cosa Nostra, our thing.
That must have been a bombshell.
It was a massive break from that long-held code of silence. Now, his testimony didn't immediately lead to convictions of the top bosses, but it provided the FBI with absolutely invaluable intelligence. It empowered them to launch a much more aggressive nationwide assault on organized crime, and that led directly to the formation of dedicated organized crime strike forces.
Okay, so even into the late 70s and 80s, it seemed like the mafia's influence was still pretty widespread. You hear about stuff like college sports betting scandals, even complex financial crimes like gas tax fraud. Their reach was still extensive, wasn't it?
Indeed. Their criminal activities stayed really diverse. The Boston College basketball point shaving scandal that involved members of the Lucchese family, it highlighted their continued involvement in illegal gambling, even manipulating college sports.
Unbelievable.
And gas tax fraud became a hugely profitable scheme, really sophisticated operations designed to just evade paying massive taxes on wholesale petroleum sales. Michael Francesi, son of a Colombo underboss, famously ran one of these schemes, made hundreds of millions. And as we discussed, labor racketeering continued to give them significant control over various industries, lots of opportunities for extortion. Even seemingly legit businesses like restaurants, especially pizzerias, were sometimes used as fronts for illicit stuff like drug smuggling. The famous Pizza Connection case illustrated that perfectly.
And their grip on Las Vegas, which seemed so tight.
Yeah.
That started to loosen during this period too, didn't it? A mix of legal changes and police pressure, I remember reading.
Correct. The mafia's dominance in Vegas gradually eroded. Nevada's state and federal authorities really intensified their efforts to regulate the casino industry and combat organized crime. There was legislation passed in 1969 that made it easier for publicly traded corporations to own casinos.
Ah, so legitimate businesses started moving in.
Exactly. Attracted legitimate investors who began buying out the mafia-affiliated interests. And critically, the passage of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the ARCO Act in 1970, provided this powerful new legal tool for law enforcement.
ARCO. We hear that mentioned all the time.
Yeah. By the 1980s, the FBI had achieved considerable success in really reducing mafia control over Vegas casinos and over the labor unions, too, through aggressive investigations and prosecutions, often using RICO.
Okay, let's delve deeper into RICO then. It's so frequently cited as a real game changer in the fight against organized crime. What exactly made it so effective?
Well, the ARCO Act from 1970, it was revolutionary because it allowed prosecutors to target entire criminal organizations, not just individuals for specific isolated crimes.
Right, going after the whole structure.
Precisely. It provided for really severe penalties, including long prison sentences and, crucially, the forfeiture of assets derived from illegal activities. Hit them in the wallet.
Okay.
And it focused on the pattern of racketeering activity within an enterprise. That made it possible to actually dismantle the hierarchical structures of the mafia. The impact was huge. Between 81 and 92, RICO charges led to convictions of numerous high-ranking bosses, underbosses, captains all across the country. By 1990, over 1,000 members of organized crime families had been convicted under RICO.
And those high-profile cases, like the prosecution of John Gotti, really showcased the power of RICO, right? Taking down seemingly untouchable figures.
Absolutely. The 1992 RICO conviction of Gambino boss John Gotti and his consigliere Frank Locascio. That was a landmark victory, and it was hugely bolstered by the crucial testimony of Gotti's own underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano.
The guy who flipped.
The guy who flipped. And the Federal Witness Protection Program, which gave cooperating witnesses new identities, financial help, protection, that played a vital role. It incentivized Mafia members like Gravano to break omertà and testify against their former associates.
Creating a domino effect.
Exactly. Led to a cascade of further convictions throughout the 90s. And as a direct result, the Mafia's overall power and influence have really diminished considerably since its peak.
We even saw something pretty unprecedented in the 2000s. A sitting boss of a New York crime family actually turned state's evidence. That must have sent absolute shockwaves through what was left of the organization.
I absolutely did. In 2003, Joseph Massino, the boss of the Bonanno crime family, he was arrested and subsequently convicted on a whole range of racketeering charges, including ordering a murder.
So he was facing serious time.
Serious time, potentially even the death penalty. And he made the historic and deeply symbolic decision to cooperate with the government. He became the first sitting boss of a New York crime family to betray omertà in such a dramatic public fashion.
Wow, a boss singing.
Yeah. It represented a significant erosion of that traditional code of silence, and it further weakened their internal cohesion, for sure.
So fast forward to the 21st century. Where does the Mafia stand today? Are they still a significant force, or more like a shadow of their former selves?
Well, in the present day, the Mafia definitely continues to be involved in various illegal activities, primarily concentrated still in the northeastern U.S. and the Chicago area.
The old strongholds.
Exactly. Now, the rise of other criminal organizations, Russian mob, various gangs, cartels has diversified the underworld landscape. But the Mafia maintains a degree of dominance in these historical areas, partly because of its deeply entrenched networks and that hierarchical structure we talked about.
But less powerful overall.
Oh, significantly reduced power and influence compared to their heyday, no question. Law enforcement remains vigilant, worried about a potential resurgence, although counterterrorism efforts have understandably shifted some focus since 9/11.
Right.
Interestingly, the modern Mafia has also shown a tendency to sort of outsource certain types of criminal work to other groups, like motorcycle gangs, for instance.
Why would they do that?
Possibly as a way to insulate themselves from direct FBI scrutiny, put distance between the bosses and the actual street-level crime.
Makes sense. Let's revisit that internal structure you mentioned earlier. It sounds incredibly rigid, very hierarchical. How exactly was it organized again?
Yeah, the modern structure, largely credited to Salvatore Maranzano back in the day, is indeed very hierarchical. At the very top, you have the boss, ultimate authority.
The Don.
The Don, yeah. Directly below him is the underboss. He's the second in command, often manages the day-to-day operations.
Yeah.
Then there's the consigliere.
The advisor, right? Like in The Godfather.
Exactly. The advisor to the boss, offers counsel, mediates disputes, kind of a trusted confidant. Below them are the caporegimes, or capos, or captains, different names for the same role. Each capo leads a crew of soldiers. The soldiers are the inducted rank-and-file members, the made men. And finally, below them, you have associates. They're not official members, not made, but they work for the family in various capacities, could be earning points, hoping to get made eventually.
And that chain of command keeps the top guys insulated.
That's the idea. Instructions flow downwards, often indirectly, providing layers of insulation for the leadership, plausible deniability.
And becoming a made man, getting inducted as a full member, that's a formal ritualistic process, isn't it?
Oh yes, very much so. Becoming a made man signifies full membership. It carries with it a certain level of protection and status within that criminal underworld. You can't just kill a made man without permission from the bosses, for example.
Okay, and the ritual itself.
It's steeped in Sicilian tradition. Typically involves a blood oath, often symbolized by pricking a finger and smearing blood on a holy card, like of a patron saint.
Wow.
Then they burn the card while the inductee swears solemn allegiance to the Mafia family and, crucially, to omertà, that unbreakable code of silence.
You break that, you're dead.
Pretty much the understanding, yes. Historically, full membership was strictly limited to men of full Italian descent. Although that requirement seems to have loosened somewhat over time, allowing guys of half-Italian heritage on their father's side.
Interesting.
Although there have been recent internal discussions, apparently, about possibly reverting back to the full Italian lineage requirement, trying to tighten things up again, maybe?
There are also some almost archaic-sounding customs associated with the mafia,
Yeah.
like that reported ban on mustaches among younger members.
That's true, yeah. The older generation, the mustache Petes, often sported mustaches. It became a kind of symbol of the old guard. The younger guys who took over, like Luciana's generation, often didn't. It became a bit of a cultural marker within the families.
Yeah.
There's also the long-standing, though often unacknowledged, incompatibility of homosexuality with the traditional mafia code. There are documented instances of violence against members who were suspected of homosexual activity.
Yeah.
Very taboo.
It's almost paradoxical, then, to learn about these instances where the mafia actually cooperated with the U.S. government. It just goes against the typical narrative of them being strict adversaries, doesn't it?
It really does. There are a few notable examples that definitely blurred that line. During the height of World War II, U.S. naval intelligence famously struck a deal with Lucky Luciano. He was in prison at the time.
What was the deal?
To ensure the security of the New York City waterfront. This was after a suspicious fire aboard the liner SS Normandy. They feared sabotage by Axis agents and figured the mob controlled the docks,
So they went to Luciano for help.
strange bedfellows, right. And later, during the Cold War, the CIA infamously engaged in these clandestine plots with mafia figures like Sam Giancana, Carlos Marcello, Sandro Trafficante Jr., the goal, to try and assassinate Fidel Castro in Cuba.
Wow. The CIA working with the mob.
It's documented. And there are even credible allegations, though maybe harder to definitively prove, that the FBI recruited Gregory Scarpa, a capo in the Colombo family, to help them locate the bodies of murdered civil rights workers down in Mississippi during the 1960s, using his particular skills.
That's just fascinating. And unsettling. A real contrast to their usual conflict with law enforcement. Speaking of which, the history of efforts to combat the mafia seems like this long, evolving battle.
It absolutely has been. As we've touched on, initial efforts were really hampered by a lack of understanding, lack of resources, even the mafia's own internal rules, like the general prohibition against killing law enforcement officials.
Why did they have that rule?
Largely out of fear of the massive crackdown, the intense heat it would bring. It wasn't out of respect, obviously. Look at the murder of Dutch Schultz. His own associates reportedly killed him because he was planning to assassinate prosecutor Thomas Dewey, fearing the backlash.
So self-preservation.
Mostly. Although earlier on, NYPD officer Joe Petrosino was killed by Sicilian mobsters while he was investigating mafia activities back in Sicily itself. So the rule wasn't absolute, especially overseas.
Okay.
But yeah, the Kefauver Committee hearings in the 50s brought the issue national attention. The Appalachian meeting in 57 was undeniable proof of this nationwide conspiracy. Joe Valachi's testimony in 63 was that watershed moment exposing the secrets.
And then Imaco really hit them hard.
Imaco was huge, especially with cases like the Mafia Commission trial in the mid-'80s. That targeted the leadership of several New York families all at once, aiming to cripple the command structure. And more recently, those massive 2011 indictments across the Northeast, described as the largest single operation against the mafia in U.S. history. It shows the fight is ongoing.
It's almost impossible to talk about the mafia without acknowledging its, well, pervasive and often romanticized portrayal in popular culture.
Oh, absolutely. You can't escape it. From really early cinematic depictions like the original Scarface, which was loosely inspired by Al Capone,
Right.
to the monumental, enduring impact of the Godfather film trilogy. Those movies basically defined the public image for decades.
And countless others since.
Countless others, plus television shows like the Gangster Chronicles back in the day, and of course the critically acclaimed, culturally huge series, The Sopranos. That really explored the psychology, the modern iteration.
Changed TV, really.
It really did. And even video games, the Mafia series, Grand Theft Auto, the Godfather tie-in games. They've all prominently featured fictionalized versions of these organizations, often contributing to this, distorted yet captivating image.
So as we bring this deep dive to a close, we've really covered a vast amount of ground here. We've looked at the shadowy origins of the American Mafia, its dramatic rise during Prohibition, its consolidation under the Commission.
Yeah, its deep and often corrupting influence on the U.S. economy, various industries, the long-determined efforts of law enforcement culminating in RICO's effectiveness.
And the intricate, often brutal structure and rituals that defined its operations.
Exactly. And while its power has significantly waned from its peak in the mid-20th century, it's really crucial to recognize that the mafia continues to exist. It continues to adapt here in the 21st century, even if it's in a diminished capacity.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, our listener. Considering this persistent nature of organized crime throughout history and the constant emergence of new criminal enterprises, what lasting insights can we really glean from the long, complex history of the American Mafia?
And maybe how might those lessons inform our approach to future challenges in maintaining law and order, especially as we navigate that often blurry line between, cultural fascination with these figures and the very real, very damaging consequences of such organizations in the real world?